This conference will now be recorded.
Thank you, everyone, for listening to and watching this legislative wrap-up webinar. This is for the 2019 legislative session. It's being presented by the League of Women Voters Minnesota. So the purpose of today's webinar is to kind of go over kind of a couple of big picture things that happened in the last week or two of session, and then also talk about where we ended up with a lot of the legislative priorities for the League this session. If we get to the end of the presentation and there's still some time left, I'm also happy to try to answer any questions you might have about the legislative process in general or anything that happened this session. Although I will say that if I might not know some of the specifics about some of the other policy details of policies or that I was not closely tracking as part of a legislative priority. I still might know something, but I might not know a lot of the details. So please keep that in mind. We're going to go ahead and get started. In terms of the session, as most of you probably know, the legislative session ended this year is a budget year. So part of the legislature's job was to pass budget bills to fund the government to ensure that the government didn't go into a shutdown. So that was kind of its big job this year is, of course, it can always work on policy. Primarily, it was appropriating money to ensure that the government could provide services to Minnesotans. As many of you know, the legislative session ended with most of the budget bills not passed, and they had to go into special session. So this slide kind of demonstrates what happened the last few weeks of session, because a lot of things happened very quickly. So I wanted to go over that with everyone just so people could get caught up on kind of where things landed. So the committees worked on their respective bills throughout most of the session. And then in early May, conference committees began to meet to negotiate details of the bills and come to a agreed upon bill that would be the final bill that the legislative chambers, the House and the Senate, would vote on. So those conference committees began to meet. There also were some preliminary negotiations and discussions by the governor, Governor Walz, the Senate Majority Leader, Paul Gazelka, and the Speaker of the House, Melissa Hortman. In case someone doesn't know, Governor Walz is DFL, Senate Majority Leader Gazelka is Republican, and Speaker Hortman is DFL. Those three individuals came to be known as the tribunal, and we'll go over, because what happened was when the conference committees failed to make a deal by the last week of session, or the last few days of session, that those three leadership individuals, Walz, Gazelka, and Hortman, began to negotiate as well. And they became known as the tribunal because the sense from reporters who had been, watching what's going on and what they had heard from some of the conference committee chairs who had talked, which wasn't very many, but what the sense was is what happened was that while Walz and Gazelka and Hortman were doing some negotiating, really what they were doing is they were calling the conference committee chairs into a meeting with those leadership members and essentially sitting in judgment to kind of say, less of a negotiation, more of a mediator in a sense. So they became known as the tribunal. That was the nickname that people were giving them. So the last week of session, the tribunal began to meet with the conference committee chairs, ask them what the status updates were on their respective budget bills and omnibus bills. May 19th, that was the last day before session ended. And what happened was the tribunal realized that they were not going to get the bills done in time before the end of session. So they made what I called the grand deal, which was kind of a big overarching, big picture deal that created a framework for further negotiations and details on all of the bills. So that great grand deal, for example, included an agreement that the gas tax would not be part of this session. Another agreement was a 2% increase for education funding this year and a 2% increase in education funding the next year. There were other parts of that grand deal that I can't remember the details off the top of my head. In terms of its effect on the League of Women Voters and our legislative priorities, there was nothing in there that affected our priorities. So they made that grand deal on May 19th. The last day of session, conference committee chairs were instructed to continue negotiating, and then regular session ended because it had to under the Minnesota Constitution. They're required to adjourn on the first Tuesday after the third Monday in May. So the regular session ended. What happened then is that the conference committee chairs continued to negotiate, and the tribunal continued to, meet with those conference committee chairs for the 21st, the 22nd, and the 23rd, and they made new deals for those omnibus bills. The chairs had informal, well, I don't know if informal is the right word. They had informational hearings. So they weren't an official legislative session, so they couldn't hold a vote on anything, but they still met and had an informational hearing on the bills that were agreed upon in the end. So, both the House, for example, the House Government Operations, or the House State Government Finance Committee met to review the state government omnibus bill, and the Senate State Government Committee met to review the state government omnibus bill in public hearings, but they were informational only. Then Governor Walz called a special session on May 24th, and it began at 7 a.m. in both bodies, or I'm sorry, at 10 a.m. And the Senate and the House continued to meet, debate, and vote on the agreed upon bills for 21 straight hours until 7 a.m. on Saturday, May 25th. One thing that did not get done was there was not a general bonding bill this session, which had been some people's hopes. There was a smaller bonding bill that was specific to housing and affordable housing, but there wasn't a broader bonding bill in general. So that's where things landed. And I believe that I think every other omnibus budget bill that the leadership was expecting did happen. So that's where we ended. Do we have any questions about what happened the last couple weeks of session before we move on to the league priorities? I'm going to go ahead and unmute for people who want to ask verbally, but then also remember you can type your question into the chat box if you'd like to do that as well. Okay, hearing no questions and seeing none in the chat box, we'll go ahead and move to the next slide and go over the legislative priorities of the league. So the legislative priorities were set by the board of directors last December in anticipation of the legislative session. And that included 6 parts. First was the complete census count. Next was fair district maps. Third was election administration and infrastructure. Fourth was restoration of voting rights. Fifth was automatic voter registration. And sixth was legislative transparency. And we'll go into details about all of these. These priorities were set this way and selected this way in a ranked order based off of importance and urgency and also political feasibility. So for example, complete census count, that's super important because an accurate census count is how we get a accurate and fair district maps. It's how we ensure we have adequate political representation in Congress and in the Electoral College. It's how we make sure we get adequate and federal funding on several federal programs. And it also provides good data for business and government planning. So the complete census count we put as number 1 because it was so important and really has an effect on a lot of other areas. And there was a real opportunity for bipartisan support there. So those were the 6 priorities that the League really worked on. Do we have any questions about the priorities themselves? We'll go over the details of each of these, of course, but do we have any big picture questions about the priorities in general? Okay. Hearing none and seeing none in the chat box, we'll move on. So a lot of people felt frustrated by this legislative session. I think even the legislative leaders, they felt pretty good about it. They called it a draw. But I know that a lot of people felt frustrated by this legislative session. For the League, I would say the theme song is the song by the Rolling Stones. You can't always get what you want, but if you try sometimes, you find you get what you need. And that really demonstrates what happened with the League priorities this legislative session. We didn't get what we wanted, but we did get what we needed. So we'll go over some of those and talk about that. So the first one was a complete census count, and really the detail of that was that we wanted to do as much as possible to support an adequate state and local action and funding to ensure a complete and accurate count of Minnesota's population in the 2020 census. Specifically, what we were seeking for in some of the bills is that we were seeking funding to the Minnesota Census Mobilization Partnership for public outreach on getting people to fill out their census surveys and answering questions about the census, especially to communities that have been historically undercounted in the census process. So we were seeking that funding for the partnership. What ultimately happened was the partnership was seeking, on the left-hand column, you can see the goal. The partnership was seeking and had asked for $2.5 million. That was kind of what the ultimate wish was. In the original bill, what happened was the original bill went to the State Government Operations Committee, but it didn't get an actual number put in because the bill was going to go to the State Government Finance Committee, and the State Government Finance Committee, as the name suggests, has the jurisdiction to determine the money side of things. And so what they decided was that really the number should be decided in the State Government Finance Committee. So the original bill didn't have that number filled in. The governor in his proposed budget had sought $1.6 million. It was not as high as we had asked for, but it was, a decent amount at least. The House omnibus bill, once it finally passed off the House floor, had allocated $2 million. So we were able to get it up a little higher than the governor's number. Unfortunately, the Senate omnibus bill did not allocate any money whatsoever for census funding outreach. So that was $0. So that went into negotiation. And what ended up in the final version of the bill was the governor's number, 1.6 million. So we didn't get what we really wanted, but we did get something, and it was better than nothing for sure. And it matched what the governor was asking for, so it wasn't like it was an unreasonably low number. It was still something. So that's where we ended up with the census funding for the Census Mobilization Partnership. And what happens is that money will then be put to use by nonprofit organizations in cooperation with the State Demographer's Office to do outreach in communities to ensure that we get an accurate census. Do we have any questions? I see one that's the question is, do you think that the census in Minnesota is adequately funded? I think we could have done better. I think that 2.5 really would have been a better number. And I think 2 million would have been a better number. But So I think we could have done better. I think we're not in a bad position. I think we're in a pretty good position. I'm pretty okay, but we're not in a bad position. I'll put it that way. So that's where we're at in terms of what I would say in terms of the funding amount. I do know that the partnership has intentions to raise additional funds from the private sector to help both in working with businesses and like chambers of commerce, but then also working with private philanthropy to raise additional money for census outreach. So we still have there's still an opportunity there to secure funding that we feel like we might still need. Any other questions about the census?
Well, this is Kay, and if it's a federal census, why are state dollars paying for it?
Okay, that's a really good question. So that actually has been a question that a lot of people have asked, and you're completely right. This is a federal program, and it is the constitutional duty of the federal government to execute a census and to count every person in the United States. Unfortunately, the federal government has not funded the census adequately at the federal level. And what happened was, then there are two options. Either states can provide supplemental funding and spend their own money to get an accurate count, or they can just accept that there might be an undercount in their state. And the implication then is that the state loses out. If there's an undercount in the state, then the state loses political power. The state loses federal funding. The state loses, gets data that isn't complete and is not as helpful as accurate data would be. So the reason that there is state funding is because it's to avoid further harm. Obviously, I think a lot of people agree and had wished that the federal government had put forward more money toward the census, but they didn't. And so the state just had to make a hard choice to either spend their own dollars or to accept the consequences of an undercount. In Minnesota, the legislature chose to at least provide some funding.
So it's legal for the state to essentially interfere with this federal process?
The state, it's not interference because the Census Bureau does coordinate with the, and Kathy just asked the question, what state agency is in charge of the census? So there is usually a point person or an agency within each state that coordinates with the Census Bureau and the regional census office, and that is the state demographer's office. The state demographer is Susan Brower. And so they coordinate with the state demographer. Additionally, what the work that this money will go towards is outreach and encouraging people to fill out the census. So it's not interference, it's essentially asking people and encouraging people to participate in the federal census program. That's what the program is for. It's essentially to ask people to participate. It's not trying to change the census program or deviate it from it. It's simply to encourage people to participate in the census survey. So that's where that comes in.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Any other questions about census? Okay, we will move on to fair district maps and redistricting. So fair district maps, the goal was to support redistricting principles and methods that provide effective representation and prevent gerrymandering. And so a lot of work was done on this year, especially by, we partnered with Common Cause Minnesota. They kind of led on this because that's the one issue that they were really working on this year. They did not actively pursue any other issues this year. It was just redistricting. So in our conversations with them as a partner, we kind of figured we would let them lead on redistricting and really just support the work that they did, so long as it didn't go against anything the league wanted to see, which it didn't. And then we would, and that allowed the league to continue working on our other priorities as well. So multiple bills were introduced to this session. Some were really good, some were not so good, and there was one bill that I think was pretty bad. So there were multiple bills this session, which kind of caused a little bit of confusion for some people and made it a little difficult to get everyone understanding where we were at. But our preferred bill this session was House File 1605, and the chief author on that was Ginny Cleavorn from Plymouth. And that bill established redistricting principles, and it also established an advisory redistricting commission with 12 public members and 5 retired judges. What happened with that bill is that it went into the House State Government Omnibus Bill, but the Senate State Government Committee, it had a hearing on redistricting reform, but it didn't have a hearing on our bill. Part of the reason being that we didn't have a Senate version of our bill by the time that this redistricting reform hearing happened in the committee. So there wasn't a bill to have a hearing on at that point. So they did hear some other bills, but not this bill. No redistricting bills were included in the Senate State Government Omnibus Bill, though. And so when it went to negotiations, there was our bill in the House and no bill whatsoever in the Senate. And the end result was that there was no bill in the final omnibus bill that will be signed by the governor, or it has been signed. I think Governor Walz has now signed all of the omnibus bills. I will say that there probably will be even better bills next session. In working with Common Cause, we've worked on some improvements to the bill to get it in even better shape. So I think that there may be another bill next session that might gain even more traction and appeal from legislators. Do you have any questions about redistricting? We have a question, does the league have a position of a statutory, of using a statute versus a constitutional amendment? That's a great question. So the League of Women Voters prefers a fully independent commission. So our bill, the 1605, what that would have done is created an advisory commission, which would have essentially made a recommendation to the legislature, and then the legislature could either say yes or no to that map. They wouldn't be able, so it was not, the legislature still retained some amount of control over the process. A fully independent commission would be able to draw a map on its own and not have to go to the legislature. Whatever passes from the commission is the new map. The league supports a fully independent commission, but under the Minnesota Constitution, currently the legislature has to have the final say over the maps. So in order to have a fully independent commission, there would need to be a constitutional amendment. So the league supports having an independent commission, which means we would support a constitutional amendment. However, a constitutional amendment, we don't know whether there's political feasibility to get that passed in the legislature. We also don't know whether or not there is feasibility to get it passed by the voters, because any constitutional amendment has to go to a ballot vote, and then voters have to vote on the constitutional amendment. That usually requires millions and millions of dollars, a lot of volunteer hours in education, and grassroots lobbying, and we just aren't sure whether or not that exists. So there is some question about would it pass. So we support the idea of a constitutional amendment. The concern is whether we can actually get it. And what the league doesn't want to do is we don't want to pass a bill that has a constitutional amendment, but then the constitutional amendment fails, and then we're back to square one with no kind of, no principles in statute, no advisory commission, none of that. I think the league's ideal would be that there would be a constitutional amendment with a backup statute, so that if the constitutional amendment failed, then the advisory commission still existed and the principles were still in statute. And I think that's maybe one potential for next session is to do something like that. So that's kind of where we're at with a constitutional amendment. We do prefer a constitutional amendment for an independent redistricting commission. The problem is that might not be achievable. And so we want to make sure that there's some kind of reform protection for the next cycle of redistricting. And if that means we can only get an advisory commission as a term, like as a matter of practicality and, realistically, then we might have to settle for that and then move for, a constitutional amendment for the next cycle of redistricting. Can any reform be done in time for 2021? Yes. So the what could happen is the next year in 2020, the legislature could pass a statutory advisory commission to be put together. That could be put together in time for 2021, which is when a map would need to be completed in early 2021. But they would have to start that commission right away, as soon as possible. It's also possible to do a constitutional amendment, but it would have to be what I talked about earlier, where there's a constitutional amendment with a statutory backup. Because what need to happen is if you have just a constitutional amendment and nothing else, the constitutional amendment doesn't go into effect until mid to late November, when the ballot question, assuming that it even passes, when the ballot question has been certified as being successful, which means that it would be November, December before you're even starting to recruit members for the commission, and the maps would be due in February, because we need the maps a certain number of months or weeks before the primaries begin in 2021. So a constitutional amendment wouldn't be sufficient for protecting 2021 if it's just a constitutional amendment. If you have a constitutional amendment with a statutory backup, what you could do is you could set up the statutory commission, get it started in May, June, July of 2020. It selects its members, it gets started, it's putting people together, it's putting together maps, and then that could be set in time for, if the constitutional amendment passes, then what happens is essentially the constitutional amendment could be written in such a way that essentially the statutory commission that already exists simply becomes the constitutional commission, and essentially just gets an upgrade. That is one potential way to protect the 2021 cycle. I think there might be it'd have to be a really, really well-crafted bill, because there's some kind of legal, I don't want to say magic, but we have to be very careful with the legal language to make sure that all of our T's are crossed and I's are dotted, but I think it is possible. Any other questions on redistricting? Okay. Next, we will talk about election administration and infrastructure. So this is actually kind of a catch-all. There was several smaller, hold on. We got one more question on redistricting. Let's go back to that real quick. The question is there any possibility that the Senate would vote for reform in 2020? I think there is. I think you'd have to have the right bill. I think you would need to have the support of Majority Leader Gazelka. And I think you would need to do a lot of work to educate the Republican caucus in the Senate. Traditionally, what happens is the caucuses rely on a committee chair to lead them on policy issues in that committee's jurisdiction. And we know for a fact that Senator Kiffmeyer has, who is the chair of the Elections Committee, the State Government and Elections Committee in the Senate, has not discussed this issue with her caucus members. So to get passage in the Senate, there would need to be a lot of education to Senate caucus members. You would definitely need to get the support of the majority leader. So I think it's possible. I don't want to say that it is not possible. I think that it would require a lot of work, though. Any other follow-up questions or redistricting? Okay. Next, election administration and infrastructure. So like I said, this was kind of a catch-all. There were actually a lot of smaller issues that we were going to support under this broader umbrella of issues. At least they were supposed to be small. A lot of these were supposed to be easy and, easy wins might be a phrase that sounds familiar to some of you. It was supposed to be an easy win. It was supposed to be bipartisan. There was supposed to be agreement on these issues. And it turns out that there was not as much agreement on some of these issues as we had hoped. So this actually became a lot more work than we had anticipated. But election administration and infrastructure, the goal was to support improved infrastructure, increase funding for election cybersecurity, ensure that there was clear guidance on how to execute election law, and increase confidence in our elections. And that ended up being essentially 5 different pieces. So the first was the Help America Vote Act election cybersecurity funding. Number 2 was voter privacy for the presidential nominating primary. Number 3 was the Voting Rights Act compliance for voter assistance. Number 4 was the elections technical changes bill, and number 5 was political apparel and clarifications on that law. I got a note from someone that says they still only see the redistricting slide. Does anyone else see the redistricting slide, or can everyone else see the election administration slide?
Administration side.
Okay, hopefully we're back on track. Thanks. Okay, so, okay, great. We're back on track. So, number 1 was election security. So there were $6.6 million in Help America Vote Act election cybersecurity funds appropriated by the federal government to Minnesota. It required a 5% match from the state, and state spending, which is pretty small comparatively, and essentially the money was supposed to be used to modernize our statewide voter registration system, as well as other cybersecurity issues for elections, and then also voter accessibility initiatives for our elections. There were 2 bills initially. One was the House File 14. That bill provided for the full $6.6 million, said, yep, you can use all $6.6 million right away. The version only provided $1.5 million. It did not provide the additional $5.1 million. And attached some policy language to it that was fairly non-controversial. What happened is that those 2 bills went to conference committee, and then the Senate simply refused to go to the conference committee. The Senate just didn't meet, didn't call the conference committee to order when it had the gavel. When the House called the conference committee together, the Senate members did not show up. So what happened was the House decided this was a high enough priority that they wanted to include it also in the state government omnibus bill. So they put it in the House state government omnibus bill as well, the full $6.6 million. So what happened was, the goal is that we wanted all $6.6 million to be allocated. In the original bill in the House, it was 6.6 million. And then 6.6 million was put into the House omnibus bill. The Senate didn't put any money in their omnibus bill. And what happened was they finally negotiated it as part of the omnibus bill. And we were able to secure the full 6.6 million. So that's where we ended up with the election security fund. Do we have any questions on the election security funds? Okay. Next is voter privacy. So this requires a little bit of history. Last session, the legislature implemented a presidential nominating primary. So in previous presidential elections, Minnesota has used the, I've got a question. What do you think the Senate was trying to do with the HAVA funds? So there are two theories that are going out there. One theory is that it was a way to appease some individuals that wanted provisional ballots and were trying to tell the Senate that they needed to hold the money hostage in exchange for provisional ballots. Personally, I don't think that was the case. My evaluation of the situation is simply that the Senate knew that the House wanted it, was going to give it up anyways, or at least most of it, or part of it, and they simply wanted the House to be distracted fighting the election security funds. They, by holding the money, by holding out until the last minute, I think they essentially were able to distract the House and essentially make them work for another issue that they hadn't anticipated working on. I don't know that we'll ever really know. But those are the two theories that are out there. So the voter privacy, back to that. So in previous presidential elections, Minnesota has used the caucus process as part of the party presidential nomination process. So that means if you nominated or voted for Hillary Clinton through the DFL party, or for Mark Rubio, the Republican Party, or Trump, or Bernie Sanders, or whoever else, when you did that at a caucus. So you had to show up in person at 7 p.m. on a Tuesday night and sit through a several hour-long meeting to participate in that process. Voters didn't like that this past election cycle. So the legislature last session changed it so that it would be through a ballot process that was executed by the state. So it is still technically a partisan process because it is the party's nomination for president, but it looks like an election and it is executed like an election. So it looks like an election. You go to your polling place, you fill out a ballot printed by the county, you put it into a ballot counting machine the county has paid for. That process, so it looks like a regular election. So that's the difference in the future. What happened was when they passed that law last session, a voter's party preference, so whether or not they were going to participate in the DFL party nomination process or the Republican party nomination process, or one of the other two major parties nomination process, that information would have been public. And not only to the political parties, but also to employers, to neighbors, to church groups, to friends, to family. They would have been able to see whether or not you voted in a Democratic presidential primary or the Republican presidential primary or another one. And there was some concern that there was really no reason for that, that was maybe disclosing more information to the public than was really necessary. A lot of the local election officials expressed concern because they felt like it was already hard enough to get election judges to volunteer on election day. And if you require them to disclose their, if they, and part of being an election judge is that you're supposed to be impartial. And so they had heard that a lot of election judges were considering not being an election judge again if they weren't able to, privately participate in a nominating process. And a lot of election officials were concerned that they were going to get complaints from voters who were going to be mad that their party preference had become public information. So thankfully, the legislature this year, they changed it so that the party preference is private information, except to the political parties. And the reason it's still available to the political parties is because the parties, because it is a party process still, it looks like an election, but remember, it isn't an election. It is still technically a party process. So the information is still available to the parties because it is a party process, and the parties needed to know who voted in their nominating process. We have a question in the chat box. Will there still be, so last year when they passed this law, they passed it in such a way that the if you wanted to vote in the primary process or the nominating process, the presidential nominating primary, you would get either a DFL ballot or a Republican ballot or one of the other party ballots if the other major parties, the marijuana parties, if they participate in the presidential nominating process. So those each party had a separate ballot. A lot of local election officials and the Secretary of State had hoped to change that so that it'd be one ballot, but you only voted in one party on that ballot, a lot like the typical primary ballot when you're voting in the primaries for like governor or voting in the primaries for governor or state auditor or attorney general, etc. And the reason they wanted that is because they felt like that would create less confusion because if a person is voting absentee, right now they'll receive at least 2 and up to 4 ballots, one for the DFL party, one for the Republican Party, and then potentially up to 2, one for each of the marijuana parties. And so election officials were concerned that people receiving 4 separate ballots would cause a lot of confusion. Additionally, it's also 4 times as expensive to print 4 times as many ballots. And so a lot of election officials were asking for there to be a single ballot because that would have reduced election administration costs pretty significantly. Unfortunately, the legislature did not pass that law this session. They did not change the number, it's not all on one ballot. We have another question. Hold on here, let me see. Will both parties know who chose to vote in the other party? Sue, that is a good question. I would have to double check on the exact language that was passed. I'm not 100% sure. I think it might be that they can see who voted in what party. I think it's possible that all the parties will know all who voted in what parties. I think that's possible. So we got a couple more questions. Will you choose the party in whose primary you vote when you show up to the polling place or some other time? Kay, that's a good question. You will choose it when you show up to your polling place. If you're going in person, you'll choose it when you go to your polling place. You'll either verbally tell the election judges there, or you will point on a piece of paper to, if you're not comfortable verbally saying it, I think the plan is that there may be an option to point on a piece of paper to which party's primary ballot you want. So you'll make that decision when you show up to the polling place. If you are voting absentee, then you'll make that decision when you receive those ballots. you'll receive those multiple ballots. You'll vote in the party that you actually want to vote in, and then you'll return only that completed ballot. So you'll make that decision when you're actually filling out the ballot. When you're filling it out absentee. Will there be efforts next session to have it made a single ballot? I think so, but it will not go into effect in time for the presidential nominating primaries because those start, the presidential nominating primary, early voting starts in January for the presidential nominating primaries. So even if something does pass, it won't come into effect until the next presidential nominating primary in 2024. And there was another question up here. Will the party candidate who receives the most votes get all the Minnesota delegate votes, or will delegates vote proportionally to the outcome? I don't know. That is that depends on the party. That is part of the party process itself. That's not part of the piece that the state implements. That's not part of the local election officials executing that. That is up to the parties. So that will depend on each party's rules. And that may be differing. It might differ for the parties as well. I think I got all the questions in the chat box. Do we have any other questions? Oh, will the league have an information kit about this new law? Our chapter is hoping to hold an education forum in our area. Yes. My plan is to have educational materials about this change so that people can understand what the presidential nominating primary is, why they're getting 4 ballots when they're voting absentee, all those kinds of things. Since this is a whole new process in voting, we will need to do some education on it. And my goal is to have kind of an educational toolkit ready for people so that local leagues can do educational forums and help educate voters on how to participate in this process. I know that the Secretary of State will also be working on some educational materials, so we'll probably coordinate with them to help, not duplicate work. And then I know that also some of the counties, like Hennepin County specifically, is also working on educational materials and outreach to ensure that voters in their counties have education as well. So there may be, there is a goal to have some league materials put together. I know that the Secretary of State will be having some materials as well. And I think some of the local governments also have plans to put together some educational materials. So there will be multiple resources that we can sort out for people. Yeah. Any other questions about the voter privacy and presidential nominating primary?
Will we still have precinct caucuses to select delegates to the county convention and such?
Yes, the regular, everything else about the caucus process, whether it be the resolutions or the party platform or the convention's nominations for other positions, whether it be party or elected positions, whatever else, that all remains the same. The only thing that has changed is the presidential piece. Any other questions about the presidential nominating primary and voter privacy? When will the presidential primary occur? I believe it happens in early March, is like the day. That is like the presidential primary day. But as many people know, in Minnesota, we have early voting, and that will also stay in effect for the presidential primary. So people will be able to early vote and vote absentee starting in mid-January. So technically it's in March, but people can vote starting in mid-January through February. Any other questions? Okay. Next on the list, what time is it? Okay. list, voter assistance. So we're going to kind of breeze through this one a little bit, but essentially the Voting Rights Act at the federal level requires, puts certain limitations on who can assist a voter. And when Congress passed that law, they were very clear that those qualifications and limitations on who can assist a voter were the only ones that could be placed. States were not allowed to add additional limitations on who could assist a voter. Well, that law was passed in the 1960s, the Voting Rights Act originally was passed in the 60s, but then it was amended again in the 1980s, which is when this provision was added in the 1980s. Minnesota had a law that was implemented in the 1950s that said only a person can only help up to 3 voters. And so that law was allowed in the 50s and 60s and 70s. But when the Voting Rights Act was amended to by Congress to say, you know, the limits on who can assist a voter are only X, Y, Z, that essentially preempted it did preempt the Minnesota law that had existed. And so what that means is currently Minnesota law is not compliant with the Federal Voting Rights Act. So there was a bill that was introduced by Representative Bang in the House that would have removed that numerical limit to ensure compliance with the Voting Rights Act. We've actually seen lawsuits in other states that have been successful in challenging other limits on who can assist a voter. And as a matter of fact, Georgia had a numerical limit on the number of people the number of voters a person could assist, and a judge entered a consent decree order saying that Georgia could not enforce that numerical limit, that it violated the Voting Rights Act. So essentially either Minnesota can change its law to be compliant, or Minnesota can be sued and lose litigation to force that this limit not be implemented. The bill didn't get a hearing in the Senate, and it was included in the House Omnibus Bill, but it did not make it through negotiations. I expect that it will probably make an appearance again next session, or there might be litigation initiated either before next session or during next session to require compliance. We will find out about that. I guess we'll see what happens. But any questions about the voter assistance issue? Okay. Next, many of you might recall that there was a United States Supreme Court case, Minnesota Voters Alliance v. Mansky. In that case, the Supreme Court held that Minnesota's interpretation of political apparel was too vague, because in Minnesota, we had prohibited political apparel inside the polling place. But the Supreme Court said that we were too vague about what we meant by political, and that was infringing the First Amendment right to free speech. Now, the good news is that the Supreme Court did clarify that Minnesota, like other states, could prohibit some things that are commonly understood to be political, but are more well-defined terms and clearer. So we could prohibit political apparel that referred to candidates on the ballot, a political party on the ballot, or a ballot question on the ballot. There was a bill introduced in the House that would have clarified that law. Because there's been a Supreme Court case on it, the state of Minnesota is only allowed to enforce the existing statute in compliance with that Supreme Court case. What this bill would have done would have just made that clarification clear in the statute. So it really wouldn't have had any legal effect that would have changed anything different from what already exists from the Supreme Court case. It just would have put that in writing in statute so that the law was more clear. Unfortunately, that bill did not get heard in either chamber. And I would guess it's probably because it really didn't have a legal effect. It really was only a change in the language used in statute, but there wasn't really any, significant difference in terms of how our elections work. So that did not make it. George, George has a question. Are MAGA hats okay now or not? That is actually a really good question. And frankly, I'm not 100% sure. I think there might be some debate on that. I would argue, and that's just me, that MAGA hats would not be allowed within the polling place because I believe Make America Great Again is a trademark owned by the Trump presidential campaign. And since it's intellectual property of the campaign itself, I do not believe, I think that is too closely tied to the political candidate, because it is literally the candidate's tagline, and the candidate literally owns the intellectual property on that phrase. Now, if you were going to talk about, there are a variety of other phrases that might be associated with a candidate, but aren't actually, aren't intellectual property of the candidate or an official candidate tagline. I don't know how that might be a slightly different evaluation. So yeah. So my answer to that is I'm not 100% sure. I would say that Make America Great Again hats are not allowed, but we will have to wait for clarification on that. And that, I believe, will come from the Secretary of State's office, and probably with guidance from the Attorney General's office. Any other questions on political apparel? Okay. Next, restoration of voting rights. So we also wanted to support the reenfranchisement of individuals with past felony convictions when they are living in their communities. This bill, there was a bill in the Senate as well, but that didn't get a hearing. But the main bill was in the House. It was sponsored by Representative Dean, who has sponsored it for several sessions now. Dean is also the chair of the election subcommittee. The bill was placed into the House State Government Omnibus Bill, but it did not survive negotiations between the chambers. I can guarantee you that it will receive significant attention next year because it has been a public pledge of the House CFO caucus. It has been a public pledge of Governor Walz. And Restore the Vote does have bipartisan support in both chambers. I think it's just a question of how, if and how it gets. So that's kind of where we ended with Restore the Vote. Any questions on Restore the Vote? Okay. Next, automatic voter registration. So automatic voter registration, we wanted to support the automatic registration of eligible voters when they interact with government agencies. The main bill that got attention, there were a couple different versions of this, but they didn't get hearings. The one bill that did get a hearing was House File 45. That was, the chief author was Representative Schultz from Duluth. That would have made it so that anytime anyone applies for a permit, a learner's permit, or a state ID card, or a driver's license from the Department of Public Safety through the vehicle services, through vehicle services, when that information would automatically be transferred to the Secretary of State, unless the individual checked a box that said, no, do not forward my information. So there was an opt-out option, so nobody was forced to register. But that information otherwise would have been forwarded to the Secretary of State's office, and then the Secretary of State would have compared the information from the Public Safety Department to various databases that contain information on who wouldn't be eligible. So for example, the Department of Public Safety also has a list of individuals who are serving a felony conviction and thus wouldn't be eligible because their rights haven't been restored yet. There's also the Social Security Death Index, as well as the Minnesota Department of Health death certificate database. Both of those indicate who has recently died, so the Secretary of State would have compared the information to those lists to make sure that nobody who had recently died would have been added to the database. So there was a review to make sure that anyone who wasn't eligible wasn't accidentally added to register to vote as well. So no ineligible voters. It would have only been eligible voters who were registered. The bill didn't get any hearings in the Senate, and it died during negotiations during the omnibus bill. I have one question that I'm going to write down really quick. That I'll get to. George, I do see your question. I'm going to get to that. Oh, no, now would be actually be a good time. Okay, the question is, was it a mistake to place all election bills into one omnibus bill? Might some of the elections bills passed independently? You know, that's a good question. I think because of the makeup of the Senate, and because Senator Kiffmeyer chairs the Senate State Government and Elections Committee, I don't think any election bills list that we talked about today would have passed independently. So, for example, one of the where'd it go? I also mentioned the election technical changes bill, which I think I missed that slide somewhere. That was its own independent bill. It was not put into the omnibus bill. And the technical changes bill are always, they are intended to just be technical clarifications, correcting errors. We forgot a comma, like super small changes. They're supposed to be non-controversial. And I know that that the author in the House and Secretary Simon have approached Senator Kiffmeyer and said, if you see anything in our version of the elections technical changes bill that you believe is controversial, let us know and we will take it out. And still, she has not heard the elections technical changes bill in her committee. So even a non-controversial bill didn't get a hearing at all in her committee in the Senate. So I don't think that any of these bills would have passed on their own this year. I think yeah, I'll just put it that way. Any other questions about elections in general before we move on to legislative transparency? How would Restore the Vote get a hearing in the Senate next session? Kiffmeyer would probably not allow it in her committee, and that's probably true. And then I think that's actually part of what the House's strategy was with Restore the Vote, is they knew that Restore the Vote would not get a hearing in Senator Kiffmeyer's committee, and the only chance of it passing was if it was passed as part of if they could pass it as part of an omnibus bill that survived negotiations with the Senate. So that was the strategy with the Restore the Vote bill this session, was that not only would Restore the Vote not pass on its own, but it's potentially, the theory was that the only way to pass Restore the Vote was to put it in an omnibus bill, which I don't know whether they'll do that again next year. This year, there was discussion about whether or not to put it in the public safety bill. And my advice to the coalition was to put it in the public safety bill. And they did not go through with that option. They put it in the elections omnibus bill. I did not think that was a smart choice, because Senator Kiffmeyer is so stringent about no elections policy whatsoever passing. And with the state government omnibus bill, with elections policy, there's not a lot of horses to trade, so to speak. But in public safety, there might be more negotiations and policies that could receive some bipartisan support to make a successful omnibus bill. But ultimately, the chief authors of the bill and the House decided not to go that route. So we'll see what they do next session. Any other questions about before we move on to legislative transparency? Okay. Legislative transparency. So we also wanted to support improving legislative rules and practices to improve transparency and public participation, including ending the use of large omnibus bills or late session rush. Obviously, we made very little progress on this particular priority this session. We did make a slight improvement over last session. Last session, you may recall that they essentially only had one omnibus budget bill. Everything was placed into one bill. This year, they did break it down into the more traditional, 10 to 12 omnibus bills that were smaller and more about one specific topic. Obviously, they were still fairly large, and they still contained a lot, but they were limited to a specific topic. So there was a natural resources and environment omnibus bill. There was a health and human services omnibus bill. So the omnibus bills were at least limited to a specific topic rather than combining everything into one big bill. So there was a slight success there. In terms of transparency overall, I think there were still a lot of frustrations. A lot of Republicans in the House were frustrated with the change in the committee structure in the House, which I think was more about there being a change rather than it being a bad change. I think there is both pros and cons to the new structure, and it really depends on who you ask on what their preference is. Obviously, there was still a lot of late session rush, and Majority Leader Gazelka pointed out that unfortunately, what's really at play is that there is the game in negotiate. Like, a lot of people like to think of the legislative process as it is with, the Schoolhouse Rock, I'm Just a Bill on Capitol Hill. There's a process. Everybody follows the process through the specific steps. But I think people tend to forget that the legislative process is essentially one giant negotiation with 203 players. Those 203 players being all the legislators plus the governor and lieutenant governor. And then, of course, there's also thousands of stakeholders who are trying to contact all of those players in the negotiation. And when you're having a negotiation like that, deadlines are really what drive a lot of deciding when you're going to come to compromise. You're going to try and drag out the negotiation as long as possible and fight for as much as you can until the last minute, until the deadline hits, and you don't have an option. You have to compromise. And that's what Majority Leader Gazelka pointed out in one of his press conferences. And I think he's right that the nature of negotiation is that you will wait until you will try to negotiate and push for as much as you can, as hard as you can, as long as you can, until the very last minute. And what that means for the legislature is usually that they don't quite make the deadline. They make a kind of a grand deal, and then they have to go to special session to actually pass the budget. In terms of legislation to fix the bill, to fix the process, there have been a couple of bills introduced. I didn't include it on this slide, but there have always been a couple of bills introduced especially by Senator Marty, for example, and I think, well, yeah, at least Marty, that would have required negotiations among leadership to be open to the public, or required negotiations between conference committee chairs to be open to the public. Those did not get hearings, and I will say that those recommendations do not have support from a lot of legislators, because they believe that private negotiations are important to the legislative process. I could speak for an entire hour over whether or not that's good or bad, so I won't go into it today. And I think that's a great discussion for another time. But that's why those particular bills don't have a lot of overwhelming support right now. One bill was heard in the House. It was House File 986, and that was chief authored by Representative Barr from East Bethel. He proposed a constitutional amendment to clarify the single subject clause. It received one informational hearing in the House. They didn't take a vote on it. They just discussed it. I think everyone kind of agreed that it was a good idea and a good start, but they wanted to have more conversation about what that constitutional amendment would look like, and what the exact language should be. So there was a general sense that the single subject clause, as currently written and as currently enforced by the Supreme Court, is not working, and that we need to clarify what the single subject clause means and how it's enforced. So I think that will probably be a continued discussion next session. Some of you might know that there was a subcommittee on legislative process reform that had been formed in the House, and there was an intention to have committee hearings to discuss potential reforms for the legislative process. Unfortunately, that subcommittee did not meet during session for reasons outside of members' control. I won't go into details, but essentially some things happened that committee just couldn't meet. It wasn't anyone's fault. I don't think anyone's mad. It just couldn't happen. And so they're gonna, I think everyone's hoping to make some efforts to make things work next session. So any questions on legislative transparency? Right, I don't hear or see any questions on legislative transparency. So just to review, what are the wins? Because I think a lot of people have been frustrated with the legislature. A lot of people feel like they didn't win what they wanted to win. For example, I know there were a lot of gun reform advocates that feel like they didn't get anything. There were people who were fighting for emergency insulin who feel like they lost. People who are fighting for the bonding bill. People who are fighting for restorative justice for veterans. There were a lot of issues that people felt like didn't get done that should have gotten done. And that includes things for the league like the legislative transparency, automatic voter registration, redistricting. So I agree, a lot of things didn't get done. But for the league, 3 things did get done. And these 3 things, that was the Help America Vote Act, election cybersecurity funding, the census outreach funding, and the voter privacy for presidential nominating primary. And those had to be done this year. So, like the Rolling Stones songs I referred to in the beginning of the session, we didn't get what we wanted, but we did get what we needed. Because these 3 things, if they didn't pass this year, the opportunity would have closed. It would have either the opportunity to use the funding would have been missed completely, or significantly reduced, or in the case of the voter privacy, that information would have become public, and there's no way to unring that bell. So those 3 issues did pass, and out of all of our issues, those were the ones that really truly had to happen this session. So it's good that we at least got those wins. So that's the silver lining that I would like to end our webinar on, is that, I understand a lot of people are frustrated, and I think everyone agrees that this session was not ideal, but we did get 3 things that really did need to get done and will help next year. So do we have any overall questions, wrap-up questions from anyone before we end the webinar? I think we're ending 10 minutes early, which is nice. So I hope everyone enjoys their weekend. Final wrap-up questions before we end the webinar. Okay, well, if anyone does have any questions, if something comes to mind, you know, after this webinar ends, or if you're someone who is watching the recording of this webinar and you think of a question, please feel free to you can I'm always happy to answer questions. You can email me at nharper, that's NHARPER @LWVMN.org. And you can, or you can give me a call. My direct line is 651-424-4603.